Good morning. Great to be together here in the middle of the week, and just want to take a few minutes and mention just some things about how good God is. But if you want to find the book of Jonah, I'm going to look at a couple of verses there in the book of Jonah. Before we get there, I did want to mention, see if I can find the book of Jonah. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. And God has been good, and God is faithful. And I want to encourage you to keep your faith in the Lord and realize that He's the one who's good. Don't keep your trust in men. Let God be true and every man a liar, the Bible says. And we are certainly seeing that, and more where, I would love to see a politician or some big name medical people stand up and just say, you know what, folks, we don't have a clue what's going on. And that would be a victory. And I'd really like him to say, you know, folks, we don't have a clue what's going on. Would you all just pray that God would guide our nation and guide our nations, that we wouldn't destroy life in the hopes of saving life. You think through all the hurt of kids being out of school, and suicide and drug and alcohol abuse, and just increased emotional problems and drug and alcohol problems, and home domestic abuse problems because of all this businesses shut down, and what a mess we've made. And I sure don't know the answer, but I know this: the government's not the answer, and I know this: the locking down is not the answer, and masks and vaccinations aren't the answer, because we've still got this stuff all going on. And Jesus is the answer, and I think we need to get back to that. But I want to encourage you, just keep your heart and soul looking to God and trusting in Him, leaning on Him, and being wise with your day as God gives you direction. I want to mention this weekend is our missions conference, and this is this is our missions book, and we just got family after family after family that we support around the world. Many of them older, many of them younger. And we've got all ages of people. And I'm looking at Margaret Stringer, retired missionary, spent her ministry in New Guinea, single lady, lovely lady. She's going to be at Our Ladies Conference again this year. And just a pleasure. Many second generation missionaries. We support the parents and the kids, and that's awesome. And our missions conference. Here's a letter I got from Mark Sigstead. And the Sigsteads were in school with my wife and me, and they went to Africa. We came to California, and they're working back and forth, helping with missionaries in the United States, helping directing other missionaries on the field. Then they're working in Africa still, back and forth. This just tells about different needs they have and work they're doing and how God provided. But here's a couple, and I'm guessing they're about the same age as us, in their 60s, and faithfully continuing to serve God. And then here's a couple, the Benefields. And the dad of Brother Benefield, he's pastored in Visalia for many, many years, I think longer than we've been here. And now Steve Benefield and his family been, I'm going to say 20 years, and I'm terrible with details, but about 20 years in Cambodia. And they're just doing a great job. And I love getting to see what God's doing on the mission field. Because, the Great Commission is not to have a house and a retirement and 2 cars and a poodle and no sickness and good health insurance or whatever. The Great Commission is to go tell everybody that Jesus saves. That's the Great Commission. And as we look through this month, our theme is missions, and get the gospel out across the street, across the world. And the great need. I know the book of Jonah gives us some stories. Now, my theme this morning is on the dealing with people that are really struggling, and you're doing okay, but this person you're talking to is really struggling, or maybe you found yourself really emotionally struggling. But Jonah's a great missionary story. Here's a total heathen country that did not want anybody to come preach to them, and yet God sent Jonah to go to this place. The missionary didn't want to go, and the people were not looking for anyone to come, but God cared. God is the one who cared. God told Jonah, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach. And Jonah got on a ship and headed the opposite direction. Of course, a storm comes, gets thrown in the water. 3 days in a whale's belly. He turns to God and he prays, and God says, "Hey, how'd you like to go to Nineveh?" Jonah says, "I'll do it." And the whale spits him out up on shore somewhere around there, and he goes to Nineveh, preaches, and literally the people hear the message, accept the message, and they turn to God in repentance. They put on sackcloth, which is like our burlap, and it's very uncomfortable, and it's not very attractive. It's a symbol of humility, of a broken heart, that we've been wrong. And they put on sackcloth and they declare a fast. The king says, "Don't even let the animals eat." And boy, there's a broken heart, and God spares the city. And Jonah, he goes up outside of town and sits up on a hill watching to see what God's going to do, because there's a promise yet in 3 days God's going to destroy Nineveh. And so he went up there to see, and of course God didn't. And in the meantime, Jonah built kind of a little hut sort of a thing, just some branches to keep the sun off him while he's watching. And in the process of time, a gourd grows up. You know how these summer gourds are around here, maybe not where you are in your part of the country, but here at the end of summer, middle of summer, once there's not been rain for months, and the weeds are pretty well gone, and the weeds even died. And then these gourds will pop up, and in a couple of days, there'll be vines, 10, 20 foot long vines, and these gourds like little watermelons or squash or whatever. You don't eat them, but they spring up. Well, this gourd springs up, grows up over this little shelter Jonah made. And he's got big green leaves, and got some gourds and cool spot, and he's just happy. He's not worried about that city down there about to be destroyed by God, but he is happy about this gourd. Well, then a worm comes along, eats something in the stem, so the gourd begins to die. A east wind blows, and just hot wind blows, and the leaves all wither, and Jonah's up there on the side of the hill, mad it's hot, and mad his gourd died, and God says, "Doest thou well to be angry?" He says, I do well to be angry even unto death. And the whole story, it's ridiculous if it weren't real, if it weren't humanity. And God says, "You're worried about a gourd that you didn't do anything," and there's 300,000 people in that city that don't know the right hand from the left, assuming that's 300,000 children, 60,000 children in that city. And then he said, many animals, or many cows, whatever the term that the Lord used. And he said, and you don't want me to have mercy on this town? And Jonah, the book of Jonah ends, Jonah's mad. And I want you to notice, though, with all that, I want to show you a couple things about this. Look at Jonah chapter 4 and verse 2. And in verse 1, it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry, and he prayed to the Lord and said, "I pray thee, Lord, was not this my saying when I was yet in my country? Therefore I fled before unto Tarshish, for I knew thou art a gracious God, and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil." He said, "God, the very reason I left my town is because I know you're merciful, and I know you're loving, and I don't want these people to have mercy and love." And the people of Nineveh had a reputation of being the most horrible, vile, and corrupt people, and an evil society. And they didn't just kill people; they dismembered them, and they humiliated, and they were wicked beyond words, wicked. And if you ever read about the Bataan Death March and the way the American POWs were treated by the Japanese, you can understand why there was some prejudice and some anger toward the Japanese. And when I think it was MacArthur, made the call at the surrender of Japan, we need 10,000 missionaries, or how many thousand missionaries, and you just got a handful of them. And I, as a young Christian, not knowing my history, I wondered, why didn't more show up? And these people were ready to receive. They were ready to abandon their ancestor worship and their traditional ways, and they were ready to consider something new. And only a handful of missionaries went. Well, now after reading the Bataan Death March many years ago, learning about how the Japanese treated American soldiers, I'm amazed anybody went. And that's how Nineveh was, a horrible, horrible, horrible nation. Jonah knew God was gracious. Now, let me just walk through the emotional battlefield that people face. And it's not just people like Jonah, but Jonah gives us the example. First, Jonah disobeys. God says, "I want you to go," and Jonah didn't want to go. Now, you want to begin. See, we see the end, the result. We see people with hearts that are broken or bitter or angry or whatever. We don't think where they came from. A lot of these problems that come in lives of people start out with disobedience. God says, I want you to do this, or I want you to get saved, or I want a Christian, I want you to go do these things, or stop doing those things. And in arrogance and bitterness, we just don't want to do it. We think we know better, or we just don't care what. Maybe God does know better, but I'm not doing it. And so the first step is disobedience. Well, the second step, knowing that there's something that we don't want to do, then like crabgrass, that, in Hebrews it says, looking diligently lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. That it troubles you, but this bitterness creeps out into the world around us, and this rebellion against God. I don't want to do your will. And it could be a kid, it could be an adult. God's no respecter of persons. Well, then God allows Jonah. He gets on his ship in a terrible storm. That's bad enough. Then they throw him overboard, and he's 3 days in a whale's belly. And I believe he died in that belly, and God resurrected him. But the point is, by the time he gets out of that whale's belly, he's got a reason to say he's got PTSD, post-traumatic stomach disorder. He's been in a whale's belly. And over in chapter 3, there in chapter 2, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and he's crying out for mercy. And Jonah chapter 3 then tells, look at Jonah chapter 3 and verse 3. And Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. 3 days, either 3 days away from Jonah, or 3 days, it took 3 days to travel around it, or whatever it was. But in verse 4, and Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey. So we're going to assume a 3 days journey means this city's so big it'd take 3 days to cross it. And Jonah went in about a day's journey, and he started preaching. That's what I'm going to assume. I wouldn't fuss with anybody about it. And he's preaching, yet 40 days, I got the days wrong earlier, I said 3 days, but 40 days and Nineveh shall be destroyed. Now so first of all, you get the rebellion. I don't want to do what God told me to do. Secondly, you get in trouble, and some bad things happen. And who cares why the bad things happen? 3 days in a whale's belly, dying and resurrecting, that messes with you. That's emotion. It's like a soldier overseas. It's like seeing a terrible car accident or kidnapping or whatever, those kind of things. And so Jonah he didn't want God to have mercy on these people, but he's been in this whale's belly. He said, well, I'm sure not going back to the whale's belly. I better go preach. See, you can do what God tells you to do and not like it. You can do what God tells you to do and not want to do it. You can do what God tells you to do and be mad at God while you do it. I remember as a boy, I had a cousin. We were back in Iowa visiting relatives, and I don't know all the parenting rules and things. I know that in our home growing up, you obeyed. I don't ever remember my brother or me disobeying a parent, ever. Now, when they were gone, we might not have done what we were told exactly right, but if my mom or dad said go, we went. If they said stop, we stopped. They said do this, we did it. We weren't about to be defiant. Well, my cousins weren't quite the same family as ours. And I don't think you have to have a Christian home to teach kids to obey. I think you have to have good parenting skills and consistency, and then a lot of mercy. And of course, God's merciful. But I remember my cousin, my uncle said, go do this. And he started to argue. And my uncle said, hey, go do this. And he starts walking away. And as he's walking away to do it, he's told, he said, I don't have to do it. And I don't want to do it. And I don't like you. And I'm thinking, oh, I'd be dead. My mom or dad would just kill me if I acted that way. And his dad and somebody else was there. I'm not sure who it was. They kind of laughed at it. He's obeying, throwing this fit, but he's still obeying. Well, what obedience is not just doing the right thing. Obedience is immediate with the right heart attitude. And Jonah, he obeyed. He went and he preached, but he wasn't happy about it. Well, then Jonah goes out on that outside of town. He goes up on that hillside, and he's got an attitude. He's pouting over his own situation, pouting over 3 days. If you went through all the suffering and hurt Jonah went through, that's enough to mess with you emotionally. And he started out in rebellion against God. It's not like he got into this difficult thing in submission and love for God and warmth, and I don't know how I'm facing these battles or why, but God, I know you're good. Jonah got into this thing not wanting to obey God, and he's 3 days in the whale's belly, and he's really a mess emotionally and physically, had to affect him physically. And it's just a big mess. And then chapter 4 starts in. In chapter 4, we find mercy from God. Just great mercy from God. And God's willing to be merciful. And so you read down there in verse 3 of chapter 4, now, therefore now, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live. He said, if you're going to be merciful to these people, kill me. You know, you hear things, people cut themselves or hurt themselves, or suicide attempts or suicide success, whatever you want to call it. I hate to say any suicide being successful, but you hear about those people emotionally doing these horrible things, and you think, what did they have to be so distraught over? What in their life was so terrible that they would want to hurt themselves or take their own life or hurt others? What would cause it? Well, see, this thing started clear back home when Jonah didn't want to obey God, and the rebellion and the I'm not going to do what God tells me to do, that ball rolling in his heart. No one saw it except God and Jonah. And then struggles come because of his rebellion. And now he's mad. He's mad because he didn't want to obey, and he had to, because when he gets out of the whale, he goes and obeys. He's mad because he was punished. You know, a lot of times we get mad when we're punished. We don't like being punished. You know, I'm speeding, I get pulled over by a policeman, I get a ticket, now I'm mad. What am I mad about? I'm the one who's speeding. But we get that way. And well, there's a whole lot of lessons here. And Jonah said, I just wish I was dead. And you might say of someone, don't overreact here. You've got a great life. You're young, you've got potential, you're smart, good looking, you've got a family, or, whatever. But you wonder sometimes. I remember years ago, a lady walking out on her husband because he just wasn't a good husband. He wasn't nice. Wasn't fulfilling her needs. And I thought, no liquor, no drugs, no infidelity, kids in a Christian school. This lady's never had to punch a clock. Husband always took care of paying all the bills, paid the kids' tuition, sat in church with his family Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and helped wherever they helped. I said, okay, he's not a very good husband, but you know what? You got a pretty good home. The lady whose husband's a drug addict, running around with other women and selling stuff that you have around the house, that lady's got some reason to be discouraged. But you know what? It's not just about the immediate circumstances. Sometimes it's the whole picture. And sometimes people have been through a lot of hurt. Whether it was their fault or not, they still went through the hurt. And maybe it did start in their own rebellion against God, and maybe they never got that thing right. Let me give you 3 or 4 quick thoughts about emotional tragedy. First of all, when you're struggling with obedience, when you begin to wrestle with whether you want to do what God has called you to do, be very careful. Just roll back your decision maker and make decisions very slow. Because when you are fighting with God in your heart, that's not a good time to make decisions. That's a time to make stupid decisions. And so when God is pushing you to do something, those are days to just, if Jonah he didn't have to go to Nineveh, but he also didn't have to get on that ship to Tarshish. Had he stayed home in Israel, maybe God could have just kept nudging him, and maybe he could have walked real slow to Nineveh or something. It's 800 miles or so, I'm guessing, clear across Saudi Arabia. And but when you're struggling with obedience, you know it. You need to step back and say, I need to be very careful, because right now my decision maker is not operating properly. And so number 1 lesson, when you're struggling with obedience, you be very, very careful. The thing to work on is not fixing the circumstance, but to fix your heart. And really everything I'm going to say here is about fixing your heart. Be very careful. But don't respond in bitterness, and don't respond in anger, and don't run off and bail out, and don't do that because you're not making good choices right now. Secondly, when you're really tired, or you've gone through a big emotional or physical or dramatic situation, 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, or maybe the death of a spouse, or the death of a child, or the death of a parent, or maybe you found out your spouse has got a serious drug problem, you had no idea, or some traumatic thing around you at work or whatever. And I've had some times when I was caught so off guard, I just could not believe the situation. But thank God in his mercy, whatever it was, I didn't make any life-changing decisions. I was very careful and deliberate in every decision. I couldn't fix or change the circumstance around me. See, many people have gone through what you and I've gone through, and they did it victoriously. Whatever battle you're facing, there are people who've gone through it, and they came out successful on the other side, and you can too. And so you need to just, number one, when you face these struggles with obedience, be very careful and very slow to make decisions, and focus your attention on getting close to God and getting over this attitude of rebellion and anarchy toward the Creator. If you're a Christian, you know better. You know better than to ignore the will of God and the Word of God. And then secondly, when you're very physically exhausted, a lady just having a baby, maybe 2 or 3 babies at home at the same time, husband's been deployed for a long time, whatever it might be, this bug that goes around, leaves people just exhausted physically. When you are just drained physically, be careful about decision making, because you're just tired. You're just worn out, and sometimes it's body, but sometimes it's physical, it's emotional tired. You're just mentally man, it's just hard. And again, be very careful about making decisions, because when you're in rebellion against God, when you're struggling to obey, you're going to make bad choices. And when you are physically or emotionally weak, you can make bad decisions. And most secular psychologists will say, when your spouse dies, don't just take off. Don't sell the house and move out and get away. You need to deal with it. You need to stay in that place, and you need to get where you accept that situation, the empty house, and all, as hard as it is. Most people would agree that any big decisions after the death of a spouse, or maybe you've gone through chemo and over, maybe your child or a sibling or your parent is going through these horrible physical problems, and you are emotionally worn down, be very careful, because you can get through this, but what you can do is you can make terrible decisions that will mess you up on the other side. The situation you'll live through, bad decisions you may not. And so number 3, try to not focus on the situation. And this is kind of like the other two, but try to not focus on the situation. Try to focus on your relationship with God. Get more time in the Bible, more time in prayer, more time doing the things that you know you need to do. Seek to draw near. Pray. Tell God I'm weak. Now, most of our prayer life is, God, fix my situation. But you and I know a lot of times God doesn't answer that prayer. But I'll tell you what prayer he will answer. Lord, give me strength in this situation. And if you spend extra time in your Bible, extra time in prayer, God will give you strength in that situation. And he may not give you deliverance from it, but he will give you strength to go through it. And then 4th, determine that you will insist that your feelings and your behavior is scriptural. Now, I may be crying. I may be sick to my stomach, but I can get up in the morning and read my Bible. I can pray. I can say I'm sorry when I've been short and abrupt, maybe unkind to my spouse or children because I'm having a tough time. That's scriptural behavior. For me to run off and get drunk, all I'm doing is getting further from God and getting myself in more trouble. Bitterness, wrath, an unforgiving spirit, a vengeful spirit, those kind of things, you know what those things will do? Those things defile us. And so now I'm going through this thing, and the situation's bad, but now I'm going through it defiled. So I don't want to go through this difficulty in rebellion. I don't want to go through this difficulty getting away from God along the way, and I don't want to let the circumstances that are out of my control get me mad at God. God's the one I need. And we need him, folks. We need the Lord. And look at Jonah chapter 4 and verse 8. In verse 8 it says, "And it came to pass when the sun did arise that God prepared a vehement east wind, and the sun beat upon the head of Jonah, that he fainted, and he wished himself to die, and said, it is better for me to die than to live." And he'd been through a lot. Terrible storm, 3 days in the whale's belly. However, he got up to Nineveh, spit up out of the whale's guts. And there's not water right up to Nineveh, maybe a small river, maybe the whale took him that far, but however, Jonah goes into town. He's preaching publicly. He's a mess. He's a mess physically. Food, water, what kind of a mess was he? And yet he's preaching, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be destroyed. And he goes up on this hillside, and the emotional stress of not being surrendered to God, that is bad enough. The emotional and physical strain of going through this trial, knowing we're in rebellion. You don't think Jonah knew he was in that whale's belly out of disobedience? And many a time you and I have faced a problem and our mind goes back, I wonder if it's because I did this. Our pastor had his little girl having some just simple surgery, tonsillectomy back in the 60s. A lot of tonsils pulled out. You don't hear about that much anymore. But they had a tonsillectomy, and all of a sudden panic. The girl's bleeding. She's a bleeder. Her blood wouldn't clot, and she's literally drowning in her own blood and gonna bleed to death on the operating table. And they, he just got the quick word, and he went to God in prayer, and got alone and began to pray, and he saw the face of a deacon in his former church that had some real problems between the two of them, and he promised God, he said, I will find a way to find that deacon. I will find a way to get right with them. And we do that. Anybody who's got any sense at all understands maybe this trial is trying to get me right. And if you don't get right, it's a strain, and it builds up and builds up. For those people who are, and you may be the one who's just normal, staying on track, but your spouse or a child or a parent struggling, going through this. Be patient with each other. Don't push them. My wife and I have made a decision early on in our marriage that you don't have to talk about it today. If there's a problem between us, we had a 3-day ballpark. If you want to be quiet for a couple days to think through this, because we didn't want unkind words said that could never be taken back. We didn't want bitter and vengeful words spoken in a situation. So if you want to wait a day, we'll be polite, pass the salt. Do you need a ride home after work or whatever? But we may not be, sitting around talking about an hour until this situation gets resolved. But we made a decision. We're not going to be bitter and hateful and vengeful, and we're not going to say things we're going to regret. And so maybe your loved one or a dear friend is the one going through, they're struggling with obedience. They're going through a terrible valley, emotional, physical distress, and all that they're facing. They may still be mad at God. And you be very patient with them. You've not been through what they've been through. And so if you look at verse 9 of Jonah 4, and God said to Jonah just said in verse 8, it's better for me to die than to live. And God said to Jonah, doest thou well to be angry for the gourd? And he said, I do well to be angry even unto death. And what a difficult situation. It started with not doing the will of God. And then it went on to some very difficult physical and emotional circumstance. When a guy comes back from a deployment, if it's been a serious, very volatile circumstance he was in, those are hard days. And that guy, he may need, emotional detox. And of course, the military knows that. They know better than me. But your spouse lost a business, maybe lost a job, or whatever it might be. Your child didn't make a team or didn't get picked or whatever. You don't know what's going on in a kid's heart. And so if you're on the outside, you be very careful. If there is some rebellion between them and God, it's between them and God. It's not your job or my job. And secondly, they may have gone through or are going through a very difficult emotional or physical time where they're just exhausted. Childbirth. I can't even imagine what a lady goes through in childbirth. And they talk about postpartum blues. And I think, I'm not a woman, but just what I know, I understand. The hormonal and the physical and the emotional and all of this thing, and how patient we need to be with one another. But I'll tell you, the story of Jonah ends with Jonah up on that hillside. And I have no idea what happened next with Jonah. But don't stay there on the hillside. Get right with God. Go to God and say, I've been all wrong. I've just been so wrong, and I'm sorry. And God is ready to forgive. Look, if God was willing to forgive, and by the way, what's so tender about this story is God keeps going to Jonah. He says, Jonah, don't you think it'd be okay if I forgave them? God is reasoning with Jonah. God could have squished Jonah like an ant. God could have tossed Jonah away like an old piece of French fry wrappers. But he was reasoning, and he's talking to Jonah, and he's trying to help Jonah understand. These are human beings, and they matter. And I know you Jews hate the Ninevites, but look, they matter to me. I'm their God. And isn't God patient? Now, look, if God's patient enough to forgive Nineveh, he's willing to forgive you. And he's a God worth clinging to. He's a God worth getting to know. And I hope you get to know him. We serve a great God. Hope you have a great day. Bible study today at 3:30, and then again tonight at 7. And hope you can join us. Have a great Wednesday.